The Mossad agent called herself Cindy. In a matter of days, she had Mordechai Vanunu completely hooked. When he was with her, Mordechai forgot he was a wanted man, hiding from his own people in a London hotel. He forgot that he had handed a journalist photographic proof of Israel's biggest secret. The Jewish state had gone nuclear, and he had blown the whistle. But Cindy never forgot her target had exposed Israel's secret weapon, choosing his personal convictions over his country's security, that he had broken the code that united Jewish Israelis. It's us against the world. Everything she did was carefully engineered to earn his trust and eventually bring him back to Israel. And that was how Mordechai Vanunu, who had sworn never to return to Israel, found himself in a sealed trial before the Jerusalem District Court as the judge read out his sentence: 18 years in prison for treason and aggravated espionage. To foreigners and activists, Vanunu was a hero, worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize. But in Israel, his sin was unforgivable, as he knew it would be. So why did Mordechai Vanunu risk everything to tell the world about Israel's secret nuclear program? Mordechai Vanunu never expected to find himself at the center of an international scandal. He was born into a large, devoutly religious Jewish family in Marrakesh. When he was 9 years old, the family pulled up stakes, leaving everything behind for a new life in the Holy Land. It was not what they expected. Israel in the early 1960s was a difficult place to live, especially for immigrants from the Muslim world, who were shoved into tent cities or one-room huts without electricity in dead-end desert towns. The Vanunus never imagined that they would be at the bottom of the racial hierarchy in the Jewish state. But even though 1960s Israel was a country of immigrants and refugees, ethnic origin mattered. At the top were the Ashkenazi Jews whose families had largely built the state. On the bottom were Arabic-speaking immigrants, like the Vanunus, derisively known as Mizrahim, a made-up term meaning Easterners, as in not Western/uncultured/uncivilized. In his early 20s, Mordechai gravitated towards the only political party that seemed to care about systemic discrimination against Mizrahim.
בני עדות המזרח שלנו היו לוחמים גיבורים. אשכנזי, עיראקי, יהודים, אחים, לוחמים.
When this same party enmeshed the country in a profoundly unpopular war in Lebanon, Mordechai lost his faith in the political system. Like hundreds of thousands of other Israelis, he took to the street in mass protest. And once he started protesting, his eyes were open to the injustice that seemed to be everywhere, particularly in Israel's treatment of Palestinians. By the mid-80s, Mordechai was organizing for Palestinian rights and calling for a Palestinian state from a university stage draped with the flag of the PLO, whose end goal was Israel's destruction. By the time he joined the majority Arab Israeli Communist Party, Mordechai's transformation was complete. From dutiful religious son to a radical leftist, ashamed of the Jewish state and of Judaism as a whole. But none of that would have been a big deal to anyone but his heartbroken parents, if not for one thing. Mordechai just happened to work at the most sensitive complex in all of Israel. On paper, the compound was nothing more than a textile plant on the outskirts of a blighted desert town, much like the one where he had grown up. But hidden underneath the unassuming buildings was Israel's back pocket, last-ditch resort, the only nuclear weapon in the Middle East. For years, Israelis had whispered about the so-called textile plants in Dimona. By the 1960s, Washington was whispering too, and the Americans sent a series of inspectors to make sure Israel wasn't doing anything crazy, like building a nuclear weapon. At the height of the Cold War, the US was pushing for fewer nuclear weapons in the world, not more.
Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
A nuclear Israel could set off an arms race in the Middle East, and there was no way that story would have a happy ending. But from the earliest days of the state, Israel's first prime minister had insisted that a tiny country ringed by enemies needed a serious deterrent. If a Jewish state was insurance against annihilation, then a nuclear weapon was the insurance for the insurance, a promise that anyone who threatened Israel's existence would go down too. So even though Israelis didn't know for sure what was happening under the sands of Dimona, most were absolutely fine with the idea of a nuclear Jewish state. If they were the David of the region, then the nuke was the stone in their slingshot. But the rest of the world didn't see things quite the same way. Under pressure from Washington, Israel agreed to regular inspections of the plant, which turned up nothing. The Israelis had made very sure of that. Even if the world suspected that Israel had a nuclear weapon, no one had concrete proof. All the employees at the so-called Nuclear Research Center were required to sign the Israeli Official Secrets Act, which made it a crime for a public servant to disclose any sensitive information. But Mordechai barely glanced at the form that would someday ruin his life. It was 1977, and the 25-year-old philosophy student needed a job that wouldn't interfere with his studies. The graveyard shift at the Nuclear Research Center beat waiting tables or driving a cab. As a technical supervisor, he just had to flick a few switches, make sure everything was working, and go back to his books. But that was before his political awakening. A few years in, however, Mordechai was deeply and vocally disillusioned with everything about his country, from its militarism, to its treatment of minorities, to its nuclear proliferation. Though it was strictly against the rules, he smuggled the camera into the plant, snapping photos of rooms he didn't have clearance to enter. Mordechai didn't yet have a concrete plan for these photos. Later, he would claim to the BBC that he wanted to save Israel from another Holocaust, a nuclear arms race that would end only in suffering and ash. But at the time, all he knew was that he was frustrated and embittered with the state that had failed to live up to its promises. His anger started with his parents, who had expected a safe haven but found discrimination and poverty instead. It blazed hotter when he thought about the Arabs who lived under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and he couldn't understand why his government believed that a weapon of mass destruction would make the country safer. So he smuggled in a camera, scoffing silently at the plant's lax security. He believed that his employers dismissed him because he was Mizrahi, just another, quote, dumb Moroccan who would do whatever he was told without asking questions, that he was too dense to understand what was going on around him, who would never dream of breaking any rules. But there was a far less nefarious reason for Dimona's relatively lax security. Israel is a high-trust society, a tiny oasis for Jewish refugees surrounded by enemies. It was unimaginable to most Jewish Israelis that one of their own could possibly work against the interests of the state. But if the guards at the complex waved Mordechai through without properly searching his bag, Israel's internal security services were keeping a close eye on his extracurricular activities. They knew about his political affiliations, his travels to the West Bank, his contact with Palestinian students, his sympathy for the PLO. A Shin Bet operative warned him in no uncertain terms that Israel's internal security services had their eye on him. But they couldn't see into the halls of Dimona, and so no one was around to stop Mordechai from photographing everything he saw in the subterranean depths of the nuclear facility. To make matters worse, by the 1980s, Israel's economy was in freefall. Hyperinflation wiped out Mordechai's savings, and soon he was laid off. Sick of life in Israel, he felt untethered from everything. No job, no meaningful relationships, no sympathy for the Jewish state, no solidarity with his fellow Israelis. His relationship with his deeply religious parents had long since disintegrated. Mordechai wasn't just secular, he was openly anti-Judaism, raging at God and at the parents who had brought him to a country he believed had failed him. With nothing left to keep him in Israel, he booked an open-ended trip to the Far East, searching for meaning in Buddhist ashrams far removed from the synagogues of his youth. He packed very little for his trip around the world, except for a roll of film, photographic evidence from inside the Dimona nuclear plant, pictures too precious and dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. He still didn't know what he would do with the photos. If he had wanted to humiliate his home country or to expose its secrets, he certainly had the chance. On his way east, he stopped for a quick trip to the USSR, whose government would have been very interested in the roll of film hidden in his backpack. But the Soviet customs agent didn't search him very thoroughly, and even though he was a loyal communist, he made no move to approach the Kremlin with what he knew. Maybe once he found himself, he would know what to do with the film. But Mordechai did not find enlightenment in the ashrams of the East. He found it in the last place he could have imagined, St. John's Anglican Church in a grimy corner of Sydney, Australia. Despite his clumsy English, Mordechai struck up a meaningful conversation with the pastor one night, and for the next 3 months, they talked about everything: philosophy, faith, the problems of good and evil. Over the course of their talks, Mordechai's anger at God melted away, and he found deep comfort in the organized religion of Christianity. It wasn't the religion of his family or his country. Mordechai Vanunu was done with Judaism.
He walked into this office one day and just said, "Stephen, I want to become a Christian. I want to be baptized." And so then we very simply went through what that meant to him and went over to the church and said a prayer, and he committed his life to Christ.
He was now an Anglican Christian, reborn in the baptismal font. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. His church was deeply concerned with social justice, and And it was during one of their weekly discussion groups that Mordechai first dropped his bombshell. "I used to work in a top-secret nuclear factory in Israel," he said. And though the pastor was skeptical, Mordechai had photographic evidence. Evidence that the international press would be very interested to see. A fellow parishioner named Oscar convinced Mordechai to talk to a newspaper. Oscar reminded Mordechai that he was a Christian now. He had a religious duty to stand up for justice, to be a warrior for peace. And to him, that meant exposing Israel's secret nuclear program. But the Australian press dismissed Mordechai as a crackpot. So Oscar put Mordechai in touch with the Sunday Times of London, whose team spent weeks verifying the photos. This was the real deal, the newspaper promised. Oscar and Mordechai would make some serious money. $25,000 for Oscar for making the introductions, and more than $100,000 for Mordechai if the story was ever expanded into a book. Mordechai claimed he wasn't in it for the money, which he planned to share with his church. And that checks out, because as soon as the paper determined that Mordechai was the real deal, the whistleblower got cold feet. He had no love for his country, but he had no desire to harm his family. If he spilled state secrets, they too might be branded as traitors, maybe even arrested. He begged the Sunday Times to forget everything he had told them so he could go back to his peaceful, boring life. But there was no way the paper was letting go of a scoop this big. Soon, Mordechai was on a plane to London, where the reporting team was putting its final touches on this career-making story. Once Mordechai had left the country with the British journalists, Oscar began to suspect he would never see the $25,000 he had been promised. Without Mordechai's knowledge or consent, he approached a seedy tabloid with a few blurry copies of Mordechai's photographs. Unlike more reputable newspapers, the tabloids had no interest in verifying the details. So before the Sunday Times could publish its exposé, the tabloid ran a story that insinuated that Mordechai and his pictures were one big fraud, and they included a photo of him, ensuring that he would never be able to melt into the crowd, no matter where he went. Not that it mattered. 3 separate intelligence agencies were already on his tail. Mordechai already had a file with Israel's Internal Security Service, but when the Sunday Times sent a reporter to Israel to speak to the Vanunus, the Mossad got suspicious. They sent an operative down under to watch Mordechai's every move. Meanwhile, Mordechai's pastor tipped off Australian intelligence too, wary of concealing a secret of this magnitude. And since Mordechai had already left Australia for London, the Australian intelligence service let MI6 know about the Israeli nuclear whistleblower hiding out in their country. The Sunday Times had whisked Mordechai to a safe house as soon as he arrived in London, but after weeks of hiding and isolation, Mordechai was a nervous wreck. He had taken a huge risk in approaching the press, and now some sleazy tabloid had told the world that he was a fraud. Meanwhile, the reputable newspaper that he had approached was taking its sweet time in publishing the story. What was the point of risking everything? His reputation, his family's safety, maybe even his life, if no one even believed what he had to say? Bored, lonely, and agitated, Mordechai took to wandering the streets of London. And that was when he spotted a tall blonde so striking he had to introduce himself. It wasn't just her looks that caught his eye. She appeared lonely, a solo tourist just as lost as he was. Exactly as Mossad had intended. They had studied Mordechai deeply and handpicked an agent who would exploit all his vulnerabilities. They had chosen well. The normally shy Mordechai couldn't stay away from this young American student, and soon they were meeting every day. The lead journalist on his story was highly suspicious of Cindy. Her appearance, out of the blue, when Mordechai was at his lowest point, was just too perfect, and the journalist warned Mordechai repeatedly that Cindy might be Mossad. But Mordechai was smitten. He assured everyone that Cindy was the real deal, that their attraction was authentic, that she wanted him too, even though she had repeatedly refused to get physical with him. She promised that things would progress between them once they got out of London, a city that triggered terrible memories of her previous abuse. Of course, the abuse was a fiction, another detail meticulously crafted to gain Mordechai's trust. So when she bought them both tickets to Rome, Mordechai got on the plane. He hoped that once they got out of London, Cindy would be able to relax and take their relationship to the next level. They would be staying at her sister's apartment in Rome, comfortable, familiar, and safe. But it wasn't her sister who opened the door to the apartment in Rome, and there was no comfort or safety between its walls. The apartment was a Mossad safe house, and behind its door was a team of agents who would haul Mordechai back to Israel to stand trial. Mordechai did not believe that he would get a trial at all. He was certain that the Mossad would execute him and make it look like an accident. The Mossad had briefly considered that option, but quickly dismissed the idea as crazy. Jews don't do that to other Jews, the Mossad chief decided. it didn't matter that Vanunu no longer considered himself a Jew, that he had betrayed the Jewish state, exposing their most important secret. Jewish solidarity was still the most fundamental tenet of Israeli life, and though Vanunu had broken his society's core rule, he was still a Jew. But that didn't mean he would get off easy. The trial was held behind closed doors, and to this day, the transcripts remain heavily censored. But everyone knew the sentence: 18 years in prison for treason and aggravated espionage. For over a decade, Mordechai was held alone. Officially, he had been placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, given the nature of his crime. Israelis, even Israeli criminals, do not look kindly on those they perceive as traitors. But Mordechai was convinced that solitary confinement was another form of punishment, not just for spilling state secrets, but for betraying Judaism itself with his conversion to Christianity. His father and 6 of his 10 siblings refused to visit him in prison. Most Israelis saw him as a traitor who deserved what he got and more.
He's a traitor, and in every other country he would hang.
But outside of Israel, Mordechai became something of a celebrity, especially in far-left circles among people who have no love for the Jewish state. He was nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize, legally adopted by an American couple in Minnesota who had hoped to bring him to the States, and celebrated among nuclear disarmament activists. Even foreign governments took up his case. The European Parliament, the Australian Senate, and some members of the US House of Representatives all called for Mordechai's early release. But Mordechai served every day of his sentence, and then some. After his release in 2004, he was detained, arrested, and sent back to prison for months at a time for violating the terms of his release. And the terms are restrictive: no leaving Israel, no speaking to foreigners without permission, no approaching foreign embassies, and if he wants to move within Israel, he is required to notify the police. The Israeli Supreme Court says these restrictions were put in place for security, but human rights agencies point out that Mordechai Vanunu has no more secrets left to spill, that the only threat he poses to Israel is further embarrassment.
Since the article was published, there is no more any secrets. All the world, every state, 180 states received these secrets. I am now ready to start my life.
Today, Mordechai lives in St. George's Cathedral in East Jerusalem, where he sees very few Jewish Israelis. He refuses to speak in Hebrew or identify as an Israeli, claiming he will only feel safe in the Jewish state once a Palestinian prime minister is in charge, statements that have not endeared him to the authorities. And the Israeli authorities have something Mordechai wants: the power to let him leave the country for Norway, where his wife is a theology professor.
Jeg drar til Jerusalem om en ukes tid, og står der I uke, og da har han bursdag.
But the government has refused his petition to reunite with the woman he married in 2015. Mordechai says all he wants now is a normal life. But as the Israeli government sees it, he forfeited that right the moment he smuggled a camera into Dimona, trading Jewish solidarity for a clear conscience. So Mordechai Vanunu remains caught between worlds. To some, he's a hero.
I have already nominated Mordechai for next year's Nobel Peace Prize.
To others, he's a traitor. Above all, he is a tragic figure, a man of ideals who separated the world into good and evil, unwilling to face the contradictions and complexities of Jewish power.